Okay, as I warned our feckless leaders, I may go a little long here. I have written a book called Black Liberation Through the Marketplace with my co-author, Marcus Witcher. And when you do that, you find so many gems and you want to include them all. So I'm going to talk fast. Pens to paper, let's go. Okay. So the question that may immediately come to mind when you hear the phrase pro-black is whether someone who thinks one can be pro-black can also be pro-white. The case that I want to make today is that Black America, on the whole, mostly, statistically speaking, I've got to speak in generalities here, has a cultural tradition formed by shared historical experiences. Whiteness is a legal category, not a culture. We can see confusion about this in these whiteness lists that have become infamous, like the one from the Smithsonian recently. An obsession with productivity and punctuality, for instance, comes from Puritan culture. That's the Northeast in particular. That is not a rugged individualist culture. When Puritans pushed west, they moved their whole town. Post office school, you just picked it up and plopped it. Rugged individualism comes from the South, which had a more scattered population and was the source of much of the American pioneer tradition. The idea that respect for authority and politeness are markers of whiteness is really ignorant. Black Americans are not culturally egalitarian. Just think of a sassy kid talking back to a black parent. Think of trying to do something in a black church without checking with the pastor. I dare you. Think of addressing your black neighbor by her first name instead of as Auntie or Miss Williams. You can actually see online Maya Angelou just absolutely schooling a young girl who asks her a question and calls her Maya. She wasn't happy. Obviously, I'm talking in very broad strokes here. Culture necessarily has fuzzy edges. But the vast majority of Black Americans are of Southern extraction and are culturally Southern. Think of the Ebonics term finna, as in they finna drag you, if you've seen that online. Finna is a shortened version of, does anybody guess? Fixin' to, right? It's a Southern phrase. You might remember a few years back when students at NYU got a couple of people fired for serving barbecue ribs, collard greens, and watermelon juice for Black History Month. Actually, black employees of the food provider picked the menu. That's because these are traditional Southern foods and soul foods, straight out of the Black Southern tradition. Black culture represents a particular slice of Southern culture because of shared experiences that developed independently of white Southerners. For instance, the Black church. Between 80 and 83% of Black Americans today identify as Christian. They are the racial group in America most likely to profess belief in God, pray, and read the Bible. The Black church is composed of 5 denominations, which are broadly Baptist, Methodist, and Pentecostal, but Pentecostalism arises in the early 20th century as an interracial movement. I'm going to go further back in history, so I'm focusing on the Black and Methodist traditions. In their famous tome, The Black Church in the African American Experience, Lincoln and Mamiya call the Black church the cultural womb of Black American life. It's that from which all else comes. The Black church gave rise to Black gospel music, which then led to blues and then jazz. The whooping style of preaching with its melodic call and response and the ecstatic worship that's so distinctive to the Black American tradition. The businesses, fraternal societies, and political and legal organizations that formed the moral and practical infrastructure of the civil rights movement. Lincoln and Mamiya call the Black church the most conservative and the most radical at the same time. Because as the only haven for authentic Black interaction, it had such a complex task. In describing his Southern rural parents to Kenneth Clark, James Baldwin said that their relationship to the church was very direct because it was the only means they had of expressing their pain and their despair. The organizations, the fraternities, the music, the economic empowerment all unroll out of the story and the theology of the Black church. So let's just quickly review some things about this tradition. Enslaved Black people were actually not generally evangelized by their slaveholders, many of whom were Anglican in the South. Slaveholders were legitimately afraid that converted slaves would have a legal and spiritual claim on freedom. They were probably thinking of the passage from Jeremiah where the Hebrews got in really big trouble for enslaving their own people. Instead, some Black people were converted to an evangelical faith through the Great Awakening revivals and then went back to their community and converted one another. This worked because the evangelists came to them They earned the right to be heard by welcoming black brothers and sisters into full communion. They made doctrine plain enough for the slaves to understand it. They appreciated their ecstatic forms of worship, and the evangelist's idea about church hierarchy made it possible to recruit black preachers and start new churches very easily, so it spread fast. In fact, in the period between 1775 and 1800, Baptists and Methodists were largely abolitionists, even making official declarations and disciplining slaveholders in their congregations, policies that they later walked back. If you take into account their revivalism and the impact of the Declaration of Independence, it becomes clearer why there were thousands of manumissions that occurred at this time, including one single group of almost 500 slaves freed by Robert Clark after a dramatic conversion experience. Black converts were awestruck by the Hebrew idea of the imago Dei, the claim in the creation story that human beings are made in the image of God, and therefore that we are all equally his children. Black theology also developed independently from white theology. Blacks resented the white plantation missionaries with their slaveholders' gospel of obedience to masters with nothing about Jesus. Instead, they secretly met with one another, often at night, to worship, pray, and preach in a phenomenon referred to as hush harbors. Black piety often brought scorn from masters who forbid them from preaching or practicing religion on their own. When black evangelist Andrew Bryan, his brother, and 50 others were imprisoned and severely whipped for gathering to worship, a cut and bleeding Andrew cried out like an apostle from the book of Acts, saying that he rejoiced at his persecution for Christ's name and that he would freely suffer death for the cause of Jesus Christ. He later became the pastor of the oldest Black Baptist church in America in Savannah, Georgia. As black theology developed organically under these circumstances, the story of the Exodus became central, such that the division in 20th century evangelical theology between theological conservatives on the one hand emphasizing salvation of souls and liberals on the other one emphasizing the prophetic call to care for the poor, this division simply does not happen in the black church tradition. It doesn't exist. God cares about souls, bodies, communities, social structures, all of it. Black theology developed a very high view of Scripture, which is certainly why black Americans after emancipation accomplished one of the greatest leaps in literacy in history thus far. Literacy and educational efforts came through the church. To this day, regular black people, which is the term I'm going to use for not the tiny slice of the black population that makes up the highly visible leftist elite. I'm an academic and my husband is in media, so we talk about regular people a lot, meaning the people who aren't in academics or the media. Have actually very conservative views on topics like gender and sexuality. And this is absolutely a result of their religious background. You can really see this quite clearly in Henry Louis Gates Jr.'s recent PBS special on the black church. I don't know if anyone watched this, but the first 3/4 of the special is really excellent. He covers much of the history that I just did. But in the last quarter, he finds one or two outlandish, theologically progressive church leaders who complain about how the conservatism of the black church holds black people back from embracing the Black Lives Matter organization, the feminist movement, and the full range of LGBTQIA++ issues. Conservatives who are Christians can defy the hopeless narrative of third-wave anti-racism by pursuing racial reconciliation within the local church community. They ought to embrace and learn from the black church tradition and think deeply about how to answer Christ's call in John 17 for unity among believers. Out of this thick set of cultural practices arises the post-emancipation efforts toward black flourishing, represented well by the great Booker T. Washington. After coming up through Hampton, Washington started Tuskegee in Alabama and created the National Negro Business League, which helped black people start and sustain businesses, support one another's businesses, own their own property, and become independent. And by the way, when you hear the term black self-help, this doesn't mean pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Okay, this means the black community working together for black economic uplift. In 1895, he was invited to the Atlanta Exposition. As a white farmer reminded Washington on his departure, "You have spoken with success before northern white audiences and before Negroes in the South and before southern white audiences, but you have never spoken to northern white people, southern white people, and Negroes all together. I fear they have got you in a pretty tight place." Washington decided to plead with the white members of his audience to support the training and economic growth of black Americans, promising that the two races had a lot to offer one another, but they needn't become socially mixed. Initially, the brilliant sociologist, W.E.B. Du Bois, praised the speech, calling him he initially praised it, calling it a word fitly spoken and the basis of a real settlement between whites and blacks in the South. But as time went on, Du Bois became Washington's fiercest critic, calling him an accommodationist who didn't care about equal political rights for blacks and discouraged higher education by focusing only on the trades. But here's the problem. Du Bois knew full well that Washington was supporting Fisk University, that he preferred to hire teachers from liberal arts colleges, and that he was secretly funding important civil rights lawsuits and encouraging economic boycotts from behind the scenes. One reason we know that Du Bois knew all of this is because Washington funded Du Bois's lawsuit against the Pullman Company. And of course, Washington did his political work in secret. Not only are we talking about the Deep South in the 1890s, but he had the well-being of Tuskegee and his entire network to keep in mind. Meanwhile, Du Bois was in a very different position up north. As historian Robert Norrell thoroughly argues in his biography of Washington called Up From History, a play on Washington's Up From Slavery, Du Bois quite simply lied and equivocated about Washington's approach because painting him as a pure accommodationist made Du Bois look better. In fact, while Washington's secret political efforts came too soon to find the kind of success that the NAACP would have later, his work in building up a propertied, educated black middle and upper class was absolutely vital in laying the groundwork for later victories. What Washington displayed was phronesis, practical wisdom. The man with practical wisdom does know what is right and good from a universal perspective, but he also knows how to apply that universal principle in the particular and complex circumstances in which he finds himself. Washington played the long game. He threaded the needle of a very delicate situation, and he absolutely succeeded in directly empowering tens of thousands of black Americans and indirectly laying the groundwork for the triumphs of the civil rights movement. Someone mentioned it earlier this week, I think maybe it was Kara Rogers, that one of the problems of presentism, of passing judgment on the past according to our own assumptions and standards, is that we make mistakes. If we buy into the accommodationist account of Booker T. Washington, and we see this at the Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, the recent TV series on Madam C.J. Walker, they buy into this accommodationist account. We believe factual falsehoods about him, and we miss how heroic and pivotal his work really was. We dismiss him. We see the same kind of mistakes arising from presentism in Matthew Desmond's essay from the 1619 Project. In American capitalism is brutal, you can trace that to the plantation. That's the name of the essay. Desmond relates modern corporate oversight of employees to the claim that the 400% improvement in cotton yields between 1800 and 1860 were the result of improved torture techniques. This is a direct reference to the work of Ed Baptist in a book called The Half Has Never Been Told. Desmond does not mention that Baptist was deeply and consistently criticized for serious economic mistakes throughout this work, including by the very authors from whose data he got his 400% statistic, Alan Olmsted and Paul Rohde. They countered that these gains were accomplished through improved agricultural techniques, including the breeding of seeds that created much larger cotton bolls. In their withering review of the book, these experts on the economics of slavery declared Baptist's whole book flawed beyond repair, and other economics of slavery experts agreed. The most egregious claim they criticize involves miscalculating the proportion of the cotton industry of the American economy. Baptist claims that cotton was a full 50% of the entire American economy in this period. The reality is closer to 5%, meaning that Baptist was off by tenfold. Others in the new history of capitalism literature habitually overstate the significance of slave labor to the overall economy, while refusing to engage with the economists pressing them on their claims. Their unwillingness to correct these figures in light of serious scholarly challenges is no longer just a matter of esoteric academic debate. Ta-Nehisi Coates, for instance, famously quoted the 50% line in a congressional hearing on reparations in 2019, referencing Baptist by name. This is academic malpractice. And don't get me started on how simply bizarre it is for Desmond to connect the farming techniques of Southern planters to corporate capitalism. In Eugene Genovese's classic Roll Jordan Roll, he clearly lays out the planter's vision of himself as a kind of feudal agrarian pater familias. Planters despised what they saw as the heartless way that the northern industrial capitalists thought of their workers in the cold cash nexus of business. There is simply no clear cultural connection with corporate capitalism. Recently, we've seen more attention drawn to some of the social engineering of blacks and whites and their relationship with one another through things like housing policy, such as redlining, and I'm sure you guys have heard about this recently. One of the most important conservative insights into the history of racial oppression in America is to draw attention to the role that progressive, centralized, top-down, federal social engineering has played. It was all grounded in the totally mainstream popularity of eugenics during the progressive era, inspired by a kind of modified Darwinism in which expert planners would shape the route that evolution took. The main players in the various eugenics organizations of the day included American presidents, members of their cabinet, heads of various governmental agencies. They were prominent university presidents and economic advisors to heads of state. It just can't be overstated how normal being for eugenics was at this time. World-famous novelists, playwrights, and poets. As Thomas C. Leonard states in his short but brilliant Illiberal Reformers, in the first 3 decades of the 20th century, eugenic ideas were politically influential, culturally fashionable, and scientifically mainstream. Some statements were bold, as when Harvard's Frank Taussig, in a widely used economics textbook no less, grieved that society has not yet reached a level of scientific sophistication such that we could proceed to chloroform undesirables once and for all, and so must use other forms of legal and economic suppression for the time being. Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes famously declared that the surgical sterilization of women is within appropriate state power since, quote, 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. His fellows on the court, William Howard Taft and Louis Brandeis, joined him in the opinion. The state imposition of eugenicist goals would reform the world. Tens of thousands of Americans were forcibly sterilized. Minimum wage laws and other restrictions on freedom of contract were explicitly used at this time to restrict the labor supply by excluding blacks and other groups. Of course, all of the rah-rah over eugenics kind of died down during World War II for obvious reasons. But by then, the Federal Housing Administration had already been hard at work, refusing to allow home loans on houses in black or integrated neighborhoods all over the country. It apparently made little difference that black people straight through to the early 60s had higher rates of employment than white people, similar rates of marriage, and higher likelihood of a 2-income household. Various groups attempted integrated housing or even just construction of equally nice segregated housing for blacks, but these attempts were shut down by the Federal Housing Administration. The plain fact is that progressive planners believed that whites and blacks would do better if they lived in separate neighborhoods. But because they refused to allow new builds for blacks or approve mortgages in their neighborhood, many black Americans had to pay for far more for worse housing than their white fellow citizens. Conservatives can draw attention to all of this. They can draw attention to the black anti-New Dealers, like the famous novelist and anthropologist Zora Neale Hurston, the author of Their Eyes Were Watching God, who was blackballed by Langston Hughes during the Harlem Renaissance for her conservatism, or T.R.M. Howard, who mentored Medgar Evers and used his wealth to build the civil rights movement and his guns to protect the family of Emmett Till during the murder trial. Conservatives can draw attention to the cases of intense persecution and even exile perpetrated by FDR's mob boss cronies in Memphis, who used police to run out of town those black Republicans who were campaigning for FDR's opponent, Wilkie. We can help people to reject the bizarre assumption that the black tradition is somehow pro-big government by necessity. The same sort of argument against progressive central planning and scorn for property rights can be applied to urban renewal, known to black people as Negro removal at the time, and the building of the federal highway system. Urban renewal was a huge nationwide scheme of slum clearance that managed to destroy poor but upwardly mobile black neighborhoods by blighting their homes and moving them elsewhere. You know, people aren't cogs. They aren't interchangeable. You can't just pull them out of their neighborhood where their community, their churches, and their businesses are, scatter them to the four winds, and then expect them to somehow just reconstitute all of that social capital somewhere else. But these schemes express the mindset of Adam Smith's man of system. It's the progressive mindset. By 1956, Eisenhower, much impressed with the military efficiency of the system of Nazi highways he experienced firsthand in Germany, signed the Federal Highway Act into law. Prior to LBJ's Great Society Project, this act accounted for the greatest non-war expenditure of federal funds in American history thus far. Since 90% of the funds for the highway system came from the federal government, it was then open season for city planners to route the highway in order to complete their social engineering goal. Now whites could commute to work in the city from their spacious suburban homes, and even more slums could be cleared to make room for the highway itself. This time, though, planners wouldn't be bothered with the legal responsibility to relocate the dispossessed, a responsibility that had been largely neglected anyway under the urban renewal programs. Moreover, planners entrenched the segregation between white and black, or out west Latino, neighborhoods by running the highway in such a way as to permanently divide them. The more decentralized policies of Jim Crow harmed black Americans deeply, but with what even more permanent effects were they harmed by the centralization of power at the federal level to enable coercive rule by experts wielding immense budgets to reshape the face of the country. Between 1940 and 1960, the black poverty rate dropped from 89% to 41%. And it was actually really 48 to 60 that happened in. I attribute this to the economic boom we saw after 1947. By the 70s, they were at 30%, but unsurprisingly plateaued, along with the general poor performance of the economy at that time. So oftentimes, poverty levels depend a whole lot on how the economy is doing. Unfortunately, black Americans were the most vulnerable to the perfect storm of circumstances in the late 60s that has helped to keep an unnecessarily large number of black Americans down through an epidemic of fatherlessness. This is an area in which, no matter how uncomfortable it makes people, conservatives are simply factually correct. There are poor people all over the world who do not struggle, for instance, with high crime. The greatest correlate with criminality is fatherlessness. The psychological evidence for the importance of father love and support is incontrovertible. But remember, the black household is quite healthy at mid-century. So what happened? I argue that there's three things happening at once. One, the contraception shock, which changed the strategic situation between men and women with regard to sex, marriage, and child rearing. Two, the hastening of the loss of manufacturing jobs because wages were pushed up too high by unions. And it's important to make a side note here, which is that unions almost completely excluded blacks from their inception to their downfall. So black men in particular really did have a genuine unemployment crisis. But that by itself doesn't explain it, because marriage was delayed, but not, the rates didn't go down during the Great Depression. And three, the crowd-out effect of Great Society welfare policies that perversely incentivize single motherhood. So what I'm arguing is that you need all three factors in order to explain why this occurred, as well as the fact that the black community is already vulnerable, economically vulnerable. So while many successful black people did gain an income, moved neighborhoods, became better educated, etc., by the time they did much of this, marriage had already been deeply undermined and weakened throughout the community. And there's also nothing particularly black about fatherlessness. While black out-of-wedlock births are at a shocking 70%, another 20% of dads live with their children. And black dads are actually more likely to be involved with their kids in day-to-day activities. The Latino out-of-wedlock rate is 50%. And the white is 30%, already far above the rate that was causing Daniel Patrick Moynihan panic in 1965, looking at the black community. Like other arenas such as criminal justice reform, the black community may bring an issue to our attention first because they are overrepresented in being affected by it. But make no mistake, these are not specifically black problems. They affect all of us. Today, the majority of black Americans have middle-class incomes and live in the suburbs. But the literal ghettoization of urban blacks, coupled with the perfect storm I just described, leaves us with totally destabilized urban environments. In these environments, rates of addiction, crime, and government dependency are high, while employment and marriage rates are low. And I want to be very careful to make several distinctions here. One, black does not mean poor. The poverty rate among black Americans is about 20%. Now, today. That's double the white poverty rate, but there are 6 times as many white people in America as there are. 2, poor white rural poverty is different in the sense that it is dispersed rather than concentrated poverty. That means that things like run-ins with police will be less of an issue, but all of the other pathologies I just mentioned are absolutely there as well. 3, many poor inner-city residents are the victims, not the perpetrators of crime. Remember that a functional community requires a critical mass of voluntary compliers with the law. You don't have to tip very far over that minimal number of determined criminals before the social costs really skyrocket. Why do I say all of this? Because some conservatives have a bad habit of using the term black culture to refer to the culture of a minority of inner-city residents who are criminal. Why are we letting gangster rappers control our concept of black Americans, particularly given the beautiful history that I just laid out? Statistically speaking, it would be far more accurate to take our cues from someone like Tony Evans or T.D. Jakes or even Tyler Perry's movies. By the way, Tyler Perry has been roundly criticized by the elect for sins against wokeness. By being careful to make the distinction between the stream of healthy black culture and history and the problems of the inner city, conservatives can encourage black Americans to embrace the best things in their own culture and history. Conservatives are speaking directly into the needs of these struggling communities when they fight for educational freedom. If everything I just told you about redlining and slum clearance and corrupt highway placement is true, then organizing school districts as cartels based on your zip code is nothing but the perpetuation of historically unjust policy, compounding the harm that's already been done. Minority parents are overwhelmingly in favor of some form of school choice, and conservatives must stand up to teachers' unions and insist that education is about children. Conservatives have another opportunity to overlap with concerns that are being raised by the black community in the arena of criminal justice reform. In the book Prison Break, How Conservatives Turned Against Mass Incarceration, Tellis describes how the prison fellowship ministry of Chuck Colson opened the eyes of many white evangelicals to the dysfunction of our criminal justice system. Do you guys know who Chuck Colson is? He was Nixon's aide and he went to prison. Anyway, he had a dramatic conversion. When a few of these ministry volunteers got into politics, they teamed up with Pew Research to show high-ranking Republican politicians in deep red states just how over the top our incarceration rates are, as well as just how much it's costing state budgets, and all of the possible alternatives that could refine the system without compromising safety. With practical wisdom, these issues were presented as overlapping with other things Republicans care about, like the growth of the administrative state, occupational licensing reform, and civil asset forfeiture. Suddenly, conservatives went from being tough on crime to smart on crime or right on crime. The most aggressive criminal justice reformers in the country are Texas, Georgia, Kansas, and Oklahoma. Did you know that? They've shut whole prisons down. And thank God that conservatives are addressing these issues. Grounded in reality and common sense, they have brought creative but realistic solutions. In the meantime, Angela Davis talks about freedom dreaming to create a world in which a panoply of government programs meet the material needs of the poor, which will eliminate crime, thus making it possible to abolish police and prisons. Someone help me understand how it's possible to be so unfamiliar with the human condition that Angela Davis can believe that young men and women whose dads are in prison, who've witnessed traumatizing violence, who've lost friends and family, whose schools are a threat to their mental and physical health, who've suffered abuse and neglect, who've witnessed or fallen prey to stultifying addiction, who've lost employment networks, and who've lost the knowledge of the fundamental building blocks of the family, will suddenly blossom into well-functioning citizens through the sweet balm of yet more government programs. Friends, 80% of black Americans want either the same number or more police on the beat. And the correlation of more police with less crime is one of the most well-established pieces of data we have in the criminal justice reform world. Real criminal justice reformers want to eliminate unaccountable policing, not police. If conservatives will be countercultural but not reactionary, they can contribute a modicum of sanity to truly necessary reform. For instance, in James Foreman's book, Locking Up Our Own, we learn that many of the changes in the legal structure that arose in the late 60s were ushered in by new black leaders who were understandably panicking because of skyrocketing heroin addiction and crime in their communities. It was they, and particularly the black nationalists among them, concerned with black dignity, who insisted on going after dealers rather than treating drug addiction as a medical issue, which was actually a live option at the time. The leftist assumption that things which have bad effects for blacks necessarily arise from white supremacy blinds them to the solutions by blinding them to the causes. Conservatives' grasp of the intricacies and importance of legal process makes them an asset in addressing hidden factors such as too much prosecutorial discretion and poor prosecutorial incentives, the boring stuff. Now that we've narrowed our focus not on Black America in general, which is doing pretty well, but to the most struggling Black communities, let's explore the conservative concept of the moral imagination. The moral imagination is not only capable of grasping the difference between good and evil in the abstract, but also of bringing creativity to the form that goodness must take to address real, on-the-ground evil. The temptation of the conservative may be to despair. Knowing how good communities function, communities that have unraveled feel hopeless. But the imaginative conservative brings hope grounded in the reality of human nature, self-sacrificial love, and the bandwidth that comes from their own well-maintained lives. And I am so happy to report that it's been done by a group of men that I call, I just made this up, the prophets of neighborhood stabilization movement. Any healthy community needs stable housing, enough to eat, employment networks, help for addiction and trauma, good education, and so many other things that are sadly lacking in our most struggling communities. While some think that such problems would be easily solved through mere policy changes, decades and decades of such attempts demonstrate the old classical liberal and conservative saw that central planning doesn't work nearly as well as we wish it would. Instead, I'd like to introduce you to the prophets of neighborhood stabilization, John Perkins, Bob Woodson, Robert Lupton, and Brian Fickert. These practitioners present a vision of shalom, wholeness, for our struggling neighbors that incorporates their whole personhood into the healing process. Communities whose sense of purpose, ownership, pride, and stability have been shredded over the course of decades must be rebuilt. There is much we can do by way of policy to make this process easier, but there is no policy that can generate or even regenerate the moral and cultural matrices necessary for family life and the social and economic networks that undergird flourishing. Nor should it. The greatest asset of any neighborhood is the people in it, and it ought to be them, not government or philanthropic planners who determine and drive the rehabilitation of these neighborhoods. The thinkers I just mentioned have instigated a paradigm shift in our philanthropic models along these lines. Some will lament that the strategies these thinkers recommend require wise, self-sacrificing people, deeply and personally embedded in the community for 8 to 10 years per neighborhood block to see genuine stabilization emerge. Rather than persisting in the false belief that there is some faster, easier, simpler way, we ought to celebrate the fact that we have finally discovered an approach that really works. Neighborhood organizations all around the country are seeing lowered crime, high school graduation, jobs instead of jail, delayed childbearing, and poverty alleviation through entrepreneurship. In Robert Lupton's book, Charity Detox, he lays out a step-by-step plan for how to make this shift for your organization. So let's take a look at his oath. That'll help you get a sense of the general feel. The oath for compassionate helpers. I will never do for others what they have the capacity to do for themselves. I will limit one-way giving to crises and seek always to find ways for legitimate exchange. I will seek ways to empower by hiring, lending, and investing, and offer gifts as incentives to celebrate achievements. I will put the interests of those experiencing poverty above my own, even when it means setting aside my agenda or the agenda of my organization. I will listen carefully, even to what is not being said, knowing that unspoken feelings may contain essential clues to healthy engagement. And above all, to the best of my ability, I will do no harm. Brian Fickert, author of When Helping Hurts, points out that chronic poverty is not just about a lack of material resources. It also includes a sense of aimlessness, unworthiness, and powerlessness. Simple provision of resources can do harm. by reinforcing our neighbor's sense that they have nothing to offer. This is why the oath above emphasizes exchange instead of gift. Each person's dignity is upheld when he becomes a contributor to an exchange rather than a mere recipient. John Perkins, founder of the Christian Community Development Association, was arrested and tortured in jail after participating in an economic boycott in Mississippi in 1970. I think he was really young at the time. Perkins became convinced that whites as much as blacks were held spiritually hostage by racism. His deep religious commitments led him to minister in the toughest neighborhoods. The organization he founded asked practitioners to commit to moving to an under-resourced neighborhood for at least 10 years. To be clear, they're not arguing that anyone who wants to do anything for these neighborhoods needs to move there. Instead, they are saying that a few better resourced and better networked neighbors, supported by and networking with those of us who are outside the neighborhood, can empower those within to carry out their own visions for business, safety, and community. Practitioners break down the barriers of us and them by entering into the lives of their neighbors actively. This is what is, let me just jump down. I want to keep in mind here Dr. Federici's very good point that should one pursue family life, staying married and raising our children is a lot all by itself, right? We don't need to try and save the world. So, but I think this is all, as individuals, very doable. So think of the practitioners more here as like missionaries, okay? So the practitioners are particularly dedicated to this calling. Those of us who do not have this calling comprise the network upon which they draw. They need us to pick up a few manageable things. For instance, pointing our church or temple giving boards towards Fickert's Chalmers Center to flip the philanthropic model of our communities away from toxic charity. You could mentor an inner city business person in a particular arena, like meeting regulations, paying taxes, or creating budgets. You could mentor a young parent. You could make connections with funding sources, such as corporate sponsors. You could volunteer to lead a garden team. My son Asher is on the Mulch Men on Saturday mornings. They mulch in the community gardens. And as they do so, the adult volunteer leads them in a discussion about their commitments to certain virtues, like maximizing potential, leading a life of nobility, living with integrity and grit, and committing to encourage others. By walking alongside their neighbors and teaching others to do so as well, prophets of neighborhood stabilization like John Perkins and Robert Woodson. Robert Woodson is the head of the Robert Woodson Center, if you've heard of their 1776 project, not the Trump one, but the Robert Woodson one with Glenn Lowry and Coleman Hughes. Perkins and Woodson help neighbors to manage their finances and become economically independent, own their own homes and apartment buildings, and institute mentorships for the reduction of violence by gangs and in schools. One of Bob Woodson's central principles at the Center for Neighborhood Enterprises is to hone in on the individuals and families that he calls social entrepreneurs. These neighbors have found ways to thrive in adverse circumstances and have been anchors on their block and in their schools. With more support, these grassroots leaders emerge as examples of what is possible for their neighbors as well. Similarly, Lucas Rugley of St. Louis's Love the Lou calls such neighbors persons of peace. Love the Lou has successfully stabilized the Enright neighborhood through personal presence, providing work through the community gardens and other enterprises, persevering with their neighbors through dangerous periods of violence, close and deeply relational work with the kids on the block, creating rent-to-own plans for refurbished homes, and providing connections with jobs. When a supporting church offered to fix up one of the beautiful but crumbling old houses on the block, Lucas made Tawana an offer. Tawana has a strong positive presence, a servant's heart, and is known and trusted on Enright. She is a person of peace. If she pays rent reliably for a period of years, the house is hers, an asset to pass down to her children. In the meantime, the COVID pandemic hit and many neighbors could no longer afford food or safely get to it, even if they could afford it. Tawana's beautifully restored home morphed into a food pantry, quite organically actually, with other neighbors helping to deliver food to 160 elderly and immune-compromised in the area. Which one is better? Lining up at a food pantry that's miles away from your home once a week to feed your children? Or walking to Tawana's house to help her make deliveries to the elderly and then taking some home to your children? Which one is more empowering? Which one is more dignifying? People are not mere mechanisms. We can't treat education, housing, and income support like we would gasoline that we put in a car to make it run. People need to be loved, to know that they are worthy, to believe that something different is possible for them. People need purpose and meaning. It's not enough that those who are struggling simply survive until tomorrow or next week. The hope of real emergence from a life of dead-end poverty must be made real, and conservatives with moral imagination, anchored in the realities of human nature and community life, are just the people to do it. Thank you. Guys, I'll do my best.
All right, thank you. That's a really wonderful way to start our morning.
Thanks.
We were wondering, so many think that there's systemic racism because all of American history is racist. How do we acknowledge actual systemic racism while bringing to light the real history it's rooted in, these big government solutions?
Boy, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? You guys always go right to the heart of the matter. So there is so much racism in American history. I mean, this is absolutely cannot be denied. You want to get into the details of it, though, as I say, right? And one of the most important distinctions, I think, to make is between proximate and non-proximate causes. I think I'm using those words right. The idea is that you can have a cause that goes back several steps, right? So in other words, you can find an instance of actual de jure white supremacy, legal policy, and it can have some part to play in what came later. And that's actually true. So I don't think we need to deny that, right? That's part of the story. But that can cause something, in terms of the proximate causes, that cannot be addressed by going back and dealing with the white supremacist law from 100 years ago. Do you see what I'm saying? It has to be addressed by what that led to eventually, whether that was neighborhood destabilization or whatever it is. And oftentimes it's not just that that's happening, right? But other things that are all coming together to get to where we are today. And so I think we need to make the case that these on-the-nose sorts of solutions are really a lack of practical wisdom. A really good example here, actually, is diversity training. Diversity, you want a diverse workforce or whatever it might be, and the assumption on the left is that if you want diversity, you need diversity training, right? Or if you have, like the Ferguson Police Department, who I've talked to some of the guys there, if you have some problems on the police department, then you need diversity training. They've all had diversity training, guys. There are studies and meta-studies showing that diversity training is not effective. It doesn't work. It doesn't make your workforce any more diverse. Okay, it's just, I'm sorry, I mean, maybe it would be nice if it did, but it just doesn't, okay? And so what's the point? The point is that you're trying this on-the-nose sort of solution, right? Where you think you understand the cause, and so you try to address it directly. But oftentimes, and I think conservatives are good at this, because conservatives acknowledge multiple sources of authority and multiple causes for things. And they tend to present a more complex view. I actually think Jonathan Haidt's book about moral foundations acknowledges this. The conservatives tend to appeal to all of the moral foundations at once, right? So it's just a more complex kind of, it takes more thought. It's more complex. And so they're very good at that. And so they can say, wait a second, these causes are complicated, and therefore our approach needs to be holistic. Right? It's not just, oh, here's a policy, ding, I'll press a button, it'll work. That's the progressive man of system mindset. But it's too simple. It's too simple. So it's going to take a lot of work to say, and that's why I'm asking conservatives to be countercultural but not reactionary. Because systemic racism historically is part of the story, right? But it's part of the story. And let me just say one more thing. I have an old blog post I wrote, and I don't even remember what I said in it, but I love the title, okay? The title is, "You're not wrong, you're just totalizing." You're not wrong, you're just totalizing. In other words, there's usually something good and true, right? And anyone who's digging into something and doing research, you can find something that's correct about that. But the story is never one lens, right? It's always multiple lenses. And it's our kind of post-Enlightenment mindset that loves to grab a lens and then transfuse the whole world, based on that lens. And so we have to complicate the story.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hello. So I was wondering, how would you recommend that we point to the Christianization, the influence of the church and Christianity on blacks' cultural experience in America as a positive aspect in the face of an opposition that would inherently call that Western corruption?
Great question. And I would say this is where conservatives really get it right, but they need to actually do it, which is that is local. That is a local issue, and it will be solved through white, and I'm going to pick on white evangelicals here because this is the black evangelical tradition, right? And so you have a genuine split between white and black evangelicalism. That's just historical fact. White evangelicals need to appreciate the tradition of the black church. They need to themselves understand the power of the black church tradition, and they will do that by spending time with their black brothers and sisters and learning about that, right, and drawing upon that. So we don't have a lot of credibility if we ourselves refer to the black theological tradition as something less than, or we're dismissive towards it. It's incredibly powerful tradition. I mean, the complexity and self-discipline required by something like the Montgomery bus boycott. Oh my goodness, the nonviolent organized action, that's really fruit from a good tree, is my point here. And so that needs to happen at the level of the local, where white and black churches are thinking deeply about how to relate to one another. That's what I would say.
Thank you.
Hi, great talk. Thank you very much.
I think you need to come a little closer to the mic. Yeah.
Sorry. So how can conservatives sort of break through the stifling sort of media and popular narratives? And it seems that simply sort of stating these facts and kind of working from that perspective, it won't be able to really change anything sufficiently because it's operating just in an environment that so vehemently disagrees.
Yeah.
And particularly from the perspective, how can a conservative statesman do something? Because I think locally, I think it's much easier to deal with something on a personal level than it is if you're trying to reach out as a statesman.
I'm not going to answer your question about the statesman because I have to say something else first. Well, first of all, I'm not a political scientist. I don't know how to do politics, guys. I know how to think about ideas. Let me say this. I think that culture, art in particular, is far more powerful than politics. It drives politics. And, what did more for, I always think of something like gay marriage. Modern Family probably had the most influence on, right? So something like a television show, okay? I would love to see a biopic of Zora Neale Hurston. Do you know that don't get me started, y'all. Oh gosh, I'm gonna start preaching. Langston Hughes, the way that he blackballed Zora Neale Hurston, have you guys read Their Eyes Were Watching God? It is an incredible novel. And she was her speech, look it up, Google it, it's called, The Colored Me, I believe is a kind of little essay she does. What it is to be colored me or something like that. It's so powerful. It's such a statement of black dignity. She's so amazing. And she did anthropological work on the last slave to ever have come over, actually from Africa, who she talked to and interviewed. Amazing stuff. It would be such great fodder for a biopic. And at the end of her life, she died penniless as a hotel maid because the communists in the Harlem Renaissance blackballed her. And she had to be reinvigorated later, right? When someone discovered her work and said, oh my God, okay. What a great movie that would make, don't you think? And so I really believe, and don't believe the thing that conservatives aren't creative. All right, we've got C.S. Lewis, Tolkien, T.S. Eliot. Give me a break. Okay? I mean, to bring it up to the level of pop culture today, I don't know if any of you have been watching The Chosen. Have you been watching The Chosen? This is a beautifully scripted, beautifully acted, beautifully produced series. It is absolutely wonderful, created by conservative Christians. So it's possible. Now, we lose our credibility with God's Not Dead 5. I said it. Okay, so my point is that I think focusing on culture, that gives the statesman then something to draw on, right? And to say, see, this history is way more interesting and complex. And you don't have to necessarily align the way they're telling you have to align. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Good morning, ma'am. Thank you for the lecture. My question has to do with specific minority programs that try and tackle that cultural issue. One of my mentors is a black man who grew up without a father. And when talking to me, he told me that it was only because his best friend's dad treated him like a son that he was able to go to law school. And now he's the dean of our university.
God bless that guy, that friend's father.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And now he tries to organize different programs specifically for black men or in inner cities to use their common racial identity, which they still have, as a way to foster a sense of personal responsibility and individual autonomy using mentorship that they have not had just from their situation in the inner city. So my question is, I know a lot of times a lot of people on the right tend to just lump these programs with affirmative action and just say all of these are minority preferential programs and we don't want to support them. But I wanted to ask, is there a conservative position for supporting some of these programs that target the cultural issue and that though they may be exclusionary, may end up helping solve that cultural issue at some level?
Your friend's program is a civil society program, is it not? It's not a government program.
Yes, it's part of our university. It's part of an administrative program focused on students.
Yeah, so I mean, in a way, that's kind of what I'm arguing today, right? I'm trying to say that that conservatives actually, it's not actually a conservative position, from what I understand, to think merely in terms of atomistic individuals, right? I mean, actually, the conservative position is to appreciate people's cultural groups. The fact that our cultural groups run along lines of race is a sad fact of our history, but that's to be expected. You know, there's nothing we can do about it now. And so I think that that's something to be capitalized upon, and that's kind of my argument, that we should look at the richness of the Black tradition. And I didn't even get to talk about some of the work ethic stuff, you guys. I mean, there's wonderful stories of the way that Black business was generated over the years. You just listen. My book will be ready for Amazon pre-order by the end of the year. Just Black liberation through the marketplace. Keep it in mind. Okay, it's all in there. Okay, but yes, that's exactly my argument. That's the way to be a pro-Black conservatism, is to appreciate that Black culture and tradition is a thing. It's a part of America. It's a part of us. It's a part of who we are. Right? What would America be without blues and jazz and Black gospel music, right? I mean, that would be a different country, okay? And so instead of, kind of freezing up when we hear anything about being Black or being pro-Black, I think we should lean in, but lean into the civil society efforts being made. I think your friend's program sounds wonderful. Yeah.
Thank you.
Good morning, Dr. Ferguson.
Good morning, Caleb. The artist formerly known as Caleb.
I was wondering if we could walk the dog a bit. I was wondering what the coroner's report would read for modern conservative alienation that you're talking about to the Black Black America. I'm wondering, is it attributing the cause to a triumphant leftist narrative, or is it a conservatism that's had to embrace a lot of differences within its thinkers? I'm thinking particularly of the southern strand of conservatism. I'm wondering At whose feet do we lay
You're
the blame?
saying why aren't conservatives associated with being supportive of the black community? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, why do we need speeches that tell us, please be pro-black? Why do we have a natural alienation?
This is a very complicated question. But, you guys, I'm going to sound like a broken record. I really feel like it goes back to the alienation between the white and black church. I really do. I could be wrong about that. But that's the on the street, on the ground, local way that people become part of each other's lives and networks. And that's what white conservatives and black people have in common. I'm not saying all white conservatives are Christian, but many, right? And the failure of, and that's a complicated story, right? What exactly happened there? But the failure of the white and black evangelical movement to reconcile, I think ultimately caused what we see now as kind of, we don't think of conservatives as, as supportive of black issues. That's why I keep going back to that. Because all of this 60,000 feet stuff isn't what changes things, right? You have to get down dirty, right, in the community. So I'm part of an organization called Civil Righteousness in St. Louis for racial reconciliation and healing. And let me tell you something. Most black Americans are not third-wave anti-racists. They're second-wave anti-racists, meaning they're Martin Luther King Jr., human brotherhood of man, kind of anti-racist, right? That's the tradition that had real hope for black and white reconciliation. Ta-Nehisi Coates doesn't want his children to be friends with white children. That's hopeless. That's a hopeless, dark vision. And it's actually the black church tradition that has had real hope when it comes to a reconciliation. We should be drawing on that, in my opinion. But I do see a lot of conservatives instead becoming reactionary. Let me give an example. Kay Cole James was the president of the Heritage Foundation. She's black. I think she just stepped down, but wonderful lady. I've seen her speak at the Acton Institute. She wrote an article about her childhood celebration of Juneteenth. It was lovely. Lovely article, all about the traditions that her family had and things. And on Twitter, you're like, you look at the response and it's all these people going, I guess the Heritage Foundation is woke now, Yeah, that's it. The Heritage Foundation has embraced CRT. Come on. I thought, come on, this is your chance. You've got a black head of the Heritage Foundation. And what was Condoleezza Rice the head of is she still? Hoover. We have major black figures in positions of power in conservative organizations, and we're not using it. We're not taking advantage of it the way that we could because we're in such reaction mode. Everybody's being snowflakes on the right? We have our own version of snowflakery, don't we? Quit it. That's not moral imagination. That's what I'm saying. Quit the snowflakery and use your moral imagination.
Thank you for walking the dog with me.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much for your talk. So unfortunately, I'm not black. And if I go back to my university and I try to make these arguments, oftentimes I feel like I'll get the counter argument of, you haven't had the same experiences, and you're just playing the same narrative that the racists are trying to.
I'm not black either. You think the trouble I'm going to get in when this book comes out?
So I'm wondering how to counter that without merely doing the thing that they expect you to do, which is to deny that you're racist and all these things.
That's such a great question. And let me answer by saying what I've thought about if I'm criticized when the book comes out. Because I'll review the book with people and they're like, so, are you ready for what people... Now, I did grow up in an extremely diverse situation. I actually had black foster brothers. So I grew up in a racially diverse home and church and neighborhood. And so that is part of my story. But here's what I actually say, which is that I don't really care about what this tiny slice of our population is obsessing about, the leftist elite buzzwords. You know what I mean? They're not representative of American Black culture. They're not representative. They're representative of elite culture. And so why should I invest all my time and energy into answering them when I could be lifting up Black people, you know, who do represent more of the norm, right, within Black culture? For instance, by saying, let me give you a concrete example here. You know, if you go to the Black Lives Matter organization, now don't get me wrong, guys, I think Black Lives Matter, but the organization is certainly Marxist, leftist, very extreme, very ideologically extreme organization. And if you go to their website, the intersectionality feels almost mercenary. You better trade your interest in your own liberation. You better trade that in for also having certain views on trans and, you know, sexual ethics and the nuclear family and all this other stuff. You know, or we won't fight with you. We won't care about you. You see what I mean? It's like, do you really care about Black people? Or are you just using them and their history of oppression to further your agenda, which is frankly what the communists have always done? It's instrumental. They've treated Black people instrumentally, okay? And so what I'm saying is I want to be able to talk to regular Black people, regular Black Americans, and say, no, you don't have to trade in your long-held, deeply held religious beliefs in order for me to care about your life. No, you don't. So what does that mean? That means I'm talking to them and I'm not really talking to these complainers. Right? I just don't care. I just quit it. And then you just go and you do the good work, right? And so I say, well, I don't know. You know, they talk to me about it. I say, I don't know. Down at Love the Lou, we're doing good work, you know? You want to come to the community garden on Saturday, buy some of our kids' stuff at their farmer's market, budding entrepreneurs? Let's talk about it there. You see what I mean? Okay.
Good morning.
Morning.
So in the Kirk reading, I'm paraphrasing a bit, he notes of socialists, their aim was not to make their goal that of the working man, but to make the working man's goal their own.
Yeah.
Actually, so last
Powerful.
spring in my university student assembly, there was a Taiwanese American president who tried to pass a bill ostensibly labeled like an anti-Asian hate bill,
Okay.
which included such gems as like increased funding for like student pornographers, increased support for
Dear God.
for like the abolition of Greek life, and more and more.
This is called mission creep. You know, everything is about everything else. You know what I mean? It's like, what does it even mean anymore? Okay.
Yeah, more today we see racial identity in America heavily tied to leftist political ideology, and I want to know how do conservative members of minority races liberate their racial identities from the snares of leftism?
Wow. I mean, yeah, that's good. I feel like I keep saying the same things, but let's just say that I think the rejection of intersectionality is really, really important, right? I am a particular person that's part of a particular tradition, and if you are asking me to overlap with everybody who you have randomly named as the oppressed, I have to lose my tradition. I have to lose it. You're asking me to walk away from my tradition. And I'm not going to do that, right? And so that's why I love the emphasis at this conference on historical particularity, where, you know, I was so angry at the end of Henry Louis Gates Jr.'s PBS special. I was so, I mean, I wouldn't agree with every single detail, but it was pretty good up until the end, you know? And then it was just, okay, now that we've told you about this beautiful, incredible tradition, now you have to light it on fire. What? How does that make any sense? And so I think that you can appeal to it in that way. You can say, you know, we have a very conservative way of life or whatever. I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but, you know, whatever, respect of elders, you know, whatever things that are very particular to your tradition, and we plan to continue that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, you've talked a few times now about the importance of the church and how the black and white church even today is so segregated, and that in the past, like for Black Americans, the church is the womb of their cultural life, and how, I mean, that's probably the case for a lot of white Americans as well. So I'm wondering, what would you suggest just as far as, like, we would think that churches in other countries, you know, they kind of have different ways of worship and different traditions.
Yeah.
And we see that between black and white churches
Absolutely,
in America.
yeah.
So what is the way forward for, like, reconciliation or integration of the churches so that we can pursue, like, these shared missions and shared goals without discounting, like, important cultural traditions and values in worship?
Yeah, now we've hit a wall, because this is exactly my question. I ask this question actually a lot. You have some people. There's a guy named Derwin Gray who's writing on multi-ethnic congregations. You have some people who are, and they're very hopeful. I mean, they have a real vision of, you know, every nation, every tribe, right? You know, and they've been very challenging to me, saying, you know, no, this is the calling. We have to come together into multi-ethnic churches. I really am not sure about that for the reasons that we just said, right? Reasons of historical particularity. I mean, the black church has been a great haven for black people, and there's a particular, you know, style of worship and theology, and so how is that even going to work, you know? And so there have been other models that have to do with, well, the complaint, right, is always that it just ends up being like a bad version of everybody's tradition. Like, you know, like you don't really know how to do that kind of music, but you're going to try, and then it just is terrible. You know what I mean? And so it's like, maybe not, that's not the route. And so other people have talked about, you know, forms of partnership. And one of the partnership between churches where you're learning from each other, but you're not necessarily, you know, actually blending. And one of the advantages of this, and something to be careful about when you do this, is that sometimes, once again, mission creep, sometimes people get confused between poverty outreach and racial reconciliation. And that's why I was so careful to make that distinction with you guys between your fairly healthy Black American community versus, you know, really difficult issues of poverty and so forth, right? And really don't just like lump these two together. We can't do that anymore. And what that means is that they'll think that they'll try and cross both racial and class lines at the same time. But my friend Anthony Bradley, who thinks deeply about these things, he gave me the example of a middle-class black church in St. Louis, First Baptist of Chesterfield, doing work with inner city churches. He said it was just as hard for them as it is for us, right? I mean, that crossing class lines is its own thing. So if you want to do racial reconciliation, do it with your own class, you know, your own class group, right? And so First Baptist of Chesterfield could have a relationship with the other Baptist church that's white, right? Or whatever, in Chesterfield, which is, if you don't know, St. Louis, but it's the kind of swanky part of town. And so that you're really focusing on that issue, right, of learning from one another, from theological backgrounds and so forth, and not confusing the two tasks, right? And the other advantage of not confusing the two tasks is that white rural poverty is a big issue too. And I don't know as much about dealing with dispersed poverty as I do about dealing with concentrated poverty. I'd love to hear more about that. And white churches, this trendy thing where everybody's going to go into the inner city, has left the white rural community in an absolute shambles, right? And so you don't do that either. What community are you in? Are you out west in the suburbs? Then go to the rural community and work with those people. Do you see what I'm saying? So that we're not mixing up the two tasks, one of racial reconciliation and the other of care for the poor, widow, and orphan.
Thank you.
Good morning, ma'am. How are you?
Good morning.
Princeton University came out with a study, and the African American community, right, the numbers who are voting Democrat are just increasing and increasing. It's like in the mid 80s. And I just sort of want to address the elephant in the room that we're being lectured about pro-Black conservatism, and yet we have not a single African American person. And
I noticed that.
We have people of color here, but
yeah,
right. And while I think that it's very endearing that other professors see us as the future of conservatism, how is that the case if we're not, like, this is an honors conference and there's not a single Black person here. And I feel that the future for the Conservative Party is actually pretty bleak. So I just wanted your comment on that.
Yeah, I want to say, first of all, I don't necessarily totally overlap conservatism with the Republican Party, so I'll just say that. Secondly, part of my motivation in writing the book is that you're a heck of a lot more likely to attract Black people into your movement if you care about their lives and their history and their culture, and you know something about them, and you're speaking into it, right? And so that's why I'm challenging you all to do that, right, is to try and expand the movement in that way. However, I will draw your attention, this is a small group, but very interesting group called the Conscious Black Conservatives, okay? They're definitely on Twitter. The Conscious Black Conservatives, and they have a website too, and they're Republicans. They are they are red, GOP people. But they really want to push back against what I might call sort of the Candace Owens phenomenon, which is the tendency to popularize Black pundits who are kind of flogging the Black community. Once again, I'm not saying that there's necessarily, something false about particular statements that Candace Owens has made, but more that she doesn't have the positive side, right? And so it's all one way and not the other. And then you get a lot of white conservatives who are like, well, look, this Black person says this, And the Black conscious conservatives are like, stop. Anyway, they're a lot of fun to follow because they're a little bit tribe busting, right? They're an interesting group. But they're saying, no, the way to attract Black people into our movement is to know our history, is to admit some of this systemic racism in the past, right? I'm not saying we're systemically racist now, but the de jure, legal policies that harmed Black people, and blame it on the progressives. That's what they want to do, right? They're like saying, look, why aren't we talking about the fact that the progressives were the ones who did all this stuff? All of a sudden, right, all it is racist. Nobody puts the progressive adjective in there. And so I don't know whether that will work, but that's their contention. And so I try to do the same thing. I try to emphasize Black empowerment, Black fathers, really wonderful movements for Black dignity, like the one that Ram was telling us about, so that there's something edifying, right? Something edifying, and not just, well, we associate you with this minority of gangster types, and that's what we're going to talk about all the time.
Okay, thank you.
Hi. So on the issue of Black fatherlessness, it's a challenging issue because a lot of times when you bring that up, there's this very reflexive reaction just to try to, I'm gonna call you racist for pointing out this problem.
Yeah, it's awkward.
And especially not only when you point out, quotes by like what you said today or Thomas Sowell or stuff like that, but often it's also referred to a legacy of like slavery, and slavery supposedly destroyed, the Black family dynamic, which I actually
that's false, yeah.
I actually took a class on Reconstruction. It's totally false. After the Civil War, you saw exactly the opposite. You'd see emancipated slaves traveling, from the South into New England and all these places to find lost loved ones.
And getting married.
Yeah.
First thing they want to do is get married.
So given that this narrative of, white supremacy having successfully destroyed the Black family dynamic, given that it disintegrates when actually, compared to real history, how do you constructively address that issue? And that I think is a very important and critical issue with, those of more leftists, and not even necessarily the hardcore Marxist leftists, but maybe more moderate leftists who tend to kind of repeat the party line without, understanding that it doesn't set up the way that they think it does.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I'm going to be hard on you, conservatives. Are you ready? I'm going to be hard on you. Which is that, conservatives complain a lot about Black fatherlessness. And as I showed, I think that's a real issue. I don't know that it's specifically Black. It's bad in that community, but it's bad in other communities too. We're seeing that general breakdown. But I don't know, and maybe I'm wrong about this. When things are done at the local level, they're hard to track. So maybe I'm wrong about this. I don't know that I see a huge push among conservatives to mentor Black fathers. So if we're going to complain about fatherlessness, and particularly for those of us who have a faith commitment to caring for orphans, then why isn't that the big push? But I feel like often the big push is just arguing about it with the left. Do you see what I'm saying? Yeah. We'd have more credibility. Well, for instance, in the pro-life movement, and this gets played down, but it should be played up. Much of the power of the pro-life movement has been the building of the crisis pregnancy centers. More crisis pregnancy centers than there are places to get an abortion. Okay, so what did we say? We said, no, we're going to put our money where our mouth is, right? We're going to make sure that these babies are taken care of. Well, you've got more credibility then, don't you? Right? Than just saying, look at you people and your screwed up situation. So I'm actually going to go a totally different route. Rather than telling you how to argue with leftists, I'm going to tell you to think about getting involved in those edifying activities.
Thank you so much for your lecture.
You're welcome.
Kind of a follow-up question.
Sorry. I'll talk to you at lunch.
Yes. So I have a follow-up question on the divide between the white and the Black churches you've been talking about.
Oh boy, I don't know if I have one more thing to say. Okay, let's see.
Okay. So my own religious community is historically white and evangelical. And in the past couple years, most Black leaders within our community have been very critical of the white leaders who reject CRT. They've said that if you're a white leader who rejects critical race theory, if you deny ideas of systemic racism or whiteness, you obviously don't care about racial reconciliation and combining our churches. And so sadly, many of those Black leaders have even left my religious community. And the interesting thing is that they're not radicals. They're not ideologues. They've read Divided by Faith. They've read This Half Has Never Been Told. And in many ways, I think they're regular people. Like you said. I agree. So I guess my question would be, how do we engage with those regular people who seem to think that CRT is at least a major part of the answer of a racial reconciliation? Yeah, I actually wrote an article about this because of the Southern Baptist Seminary presidents who affirmed the dedication of racial reconciliation, but took that opportunity to make a statement about CRT, and then a lot of the Black pastors in the Southern Baptist Convention withdrew as a result. And the argument that I made, and you can read it at Discourse online if you're interested, the argument that I made is that I agree with you. I don't think these Black pastors believe in critical race theory.
I really don't. I mean, I think that they have a 200-year-old anti-racist tradition based in the story of the Exodus. And they're drawing on that. And they're seeing the conservative obsession with CRT as prioritizing culture war issues over their relationship with their fellow believers. I think that's how they're interpreting it, because why would the seminary presidents decide to just toss in this statement, well, it's not CRT? Once again, it's sort of like the K. Cole James example. Is there a wave of critical race theory going through the Southern Baptist Convention? No. No, there's just not. Is there a push for racial reconciliation within the Southern Baptist Convention? Yes. Those are two different things. And I know I'm being controversial now, okay, but this is my opinion. and those are two different things, and we have to find a way to work with our brothers and sisters in the church and show them that we care more about that than we care about the culture war that's happening in politics. And the problem is that we have become very politicized. That's a difficult legacy. I mean, the guys in the moral majority, let's think about this for a second. The guys in the moral majority, you guys know this in the 90s, the moral majority? A lot of them really regretted that. Like, they really regretted that. They wrote books about it. And they said stuff like, we thought we were going to use them and they used us, in terms of politics. It hasn't been a great story of churches getting really into the culture war. So all of that to say, what's your role? What's your task, right? If your main task is in the church and you're doing racial reconciliation, then do that. Don't mix it with all this other stuff. If you're in a university, you need to fight CRT. You don't need to fight CRT at your little Baptist church, because that's not the realm where CRT is a problem. The realm where CRT is a problem is over here. Do you see what I mean? You have other problems in your little Baptist church. So anyway, it's a very complex cultural situation, for sure. But yeah, if you guys want to read my article, it's online.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Thank you.